At 06:50 in the morning on June 6, 1944, a Higgins boat lowered its ramp into chest-deep water off a stretch of Norman coastline the Allied planners had labelled Easy Red. Machine gun fire ripped across the surface of the surf, cutting men down before they ever touched the sand. The first soldier off that boat was a Polish-American sergeant named Philip Streczek, a truck driver from East Brunswick, New Jersey, before the war. Behind him came his section leader, a 29-year-old former sports writer from Owensboro, Kentucky, named John Spaulding. Behind them was a coastline being turned into a slaughterhouse. Within 400 yards of the surf, the most carefully rehearsed amphibious plan in human history was already in pieces. The radios were drowned, the supporting tanks were sunk. The naval barrage had landed harmlessly inland. Officers were dead in the wash, face down in the bloody foam. And on a fortified bluff that looked impossible to climb, German machine gunners of the 352nd Infantry Division, with elements of the static 716th holding the flanks, were firing every weapon they owned into the men of the 1st Infantry Division. This is the story of what American junior leaders did when the plans died. Not in one battle, but in many battles. From the cliffs of Normandy to the volcanic ash of Iwo Jima, from the snow of the Ardennes to the ruined villages of the Colmar Pocket. This is the story of how lieutenants, captains, and sergeants kept attacks moving forward when nothing was working as it had been drawn up to work. The doctrine they fought under was a peculiar thing. By the late 1930s, the German army had codified a concept it called mission-type tactics. Subordinates were given an objective and trusted to figure out how to reach it. The American army, by contrast, was famous for producing operations orders the size of telephone books, detailed timetables, rigid phase lines, every movement calculated to the minute. On paper, the Wehrmacht should have run circles around the American GI. But buried inside a doctrinal manual called Infantry in Battle, prepared in 1934 under then-Lieutenant Colonel George Marshall at the infantry school, was an idea that would echo across the next decade of war. The manual taught, in chapter after chapter, that small groups of resolute men frequently decide engagements. That principle, almost casually inserted into a training pamphlet, would prove to be one of the most important ideas ever taught in American military doctrine. The first hard test came at Kasserine Pass in February 1943. Lieutenant General Lloyd Fredendall's Second Corps was hammered by Field Marshal Erwin Rommel through the Tunisian dorsals. American casualties reached approximately 6,500 against roughly 2,000 Axis losses. Fredendall was relieved on March 6, 1943, and replaced by George Patton. But the recovery, as Dwight Eisenhower himself later wrote, came not from generals. It came from sergeants and lieutenants who learned, fast, how to mass artillery, how to combine arms, and how to stop running. Kasserine taught the army that its officers had to be allowed to make decisions on the spot. By the time the same army landed at Sicily 5 months later, that lesson was beginning to bite. In Operation Husky, which began on the night of July 9 to 10, 1943, Colonel James Gavin, commanding the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment of the 82nd Airborne Division, jumped out of a transport aircraft into a 35-mile-per-hour wind. When he hit the ground, he could not at first determine whether he was even on the right island. He was, in fact, nearly 30 miles from his drop zone. He gathered men he had never met and marched toward the sound of the guns. On July 11, at a coastal feature called Piazza Ridge, with a few light artillery pieces and bazookas, his improvised force stopped tanks of the Hermann Goering Division from rolling into the Gila beachhead. The Husky drop was a tactical disaster, but Gavin's stand at Piazza Ridge proved a doctrinal point that would echo through Normandy. When the plan dies, you go forward with whoever is left. By the spring of 1944, 2.5 years of war had produced an American small unit officer corps that was slowly learning to think for itself. Officer candidate schools across the country, at peak production, were turning out tens of thousands of commissioned junior officers per year. They were not the products of West Point culture. They were former businessmen, miners, sports writers, college dropouts, pulled out of civilian life and put through a 90-day course that emphasized initiative because nothing else fit the manpower demands of the war. Streczek was a truck driver. A young Swedish-American named Eric Gibson was a company cook. Audie Murphy had been a poor sharecropper's son from Texas. They were not the German junker class. They were the American middle class, with bayonets. In the early hours of June 6, 1944, that middle class with bayonets was about to be tested as no American force had ever been tested before. The mission was Operation Overlord, the liberation of occupied France. The 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions, supported by Rangers, engineers, tankers, and naval gunfire, were to land on a 5-mile stretch of Norman Beach. The planners had divided into sectors named Charlie, Dog, Easy, and Fox. The men called the whole thing Omaha. By the end of the day, more than 2,000 Americans would be dead, wounded, or missing on that beach, and the entire success of the invasion would hinge on a few dozen junior leaders who refused to lie down. Brigadier General Norman Cotter, 51 years old, Assistant Division Commander of the 29th Infantry Division, came ashore on Dog White at approximately 07:30. The first 3 men out of his landing craft were killed. Within minutes, 2 officers of his command staff were dead within feet of him. Cotter had warned his subordinates in the spring that things would not go as planned. He had no idea how right he was. Most of the 116th Infantry's first wave had been destroyed. The amphibious tanks of the 743rd Tank Battalion were largely sunk. Engineer task force casualties on the obstacle belt approached 50%. Cotter walked the seawall. He yelled at men to move. He found a unit pinned at the base of the bluff and asked, "What outfit is this?" A voice answered, "5th Rangers." Cotter replied, "Well then, Rangers, lead the way." The phrase, in the form, "Rangers lead the way," became the official motto of the 75th Ranger Regiment. Cotter then personally walked over to a Bangalore-equipped engineer, supervised the blowing of the wire, and when the first man through the gap was killed by sniper fire and the rest of the men froze, he, a brigadier general of the United States Army, leaped up himself and ran through the gap. Soldiers followed. He led a small party up a communications trench to the bluff top. He found an anti-tank wall blocking the Vierville exit, located a Sherman tank loaded with explosives, and had it blown. By mid-morning he was walking into the village of Vierville-sur-Mer. He greeted late arrivals with the words, "Where the hell have you been, boys?" On June 29, 1944, he was decorated with the Distinguished Service Cross. Roughly 2 miles east, Colonel George Taylor of the 16th Infantry Regiment, a veteran of the Sicily landings, landed in a later wave on Easy Red. The shingle was carpeted with the dead and wounded of his own regiment. Taylor walked from man to man. He shouted what would become the most quoted American line of the entire day. "Two kinds of people are staying on this beach, the dead and those who are going to die. Now let's get the hell out of here." The line was Taylor's, even though Hollywood later put it in the mouth of Cotter in The Longest Day. Taylor's Distinguished Service Cross citation specifically credits him with personally clearing an exit and pushing groups of unrelated soldiers forward under nearby non-commissioned officers. By 09:30, the regimental command post was set up just below the bluff crest. Taylor was promoted to Brigadier General on August 1, 1944. But before any general or colonel walked the seawall, Sergeant Stretchick was already moving. He could smell, he later told historians, where the German mines were not. Stretchick and Private First Class Richard Gallagher slipped through a brushy ravine between 2 German strongpoints. They found a defile, marked it, came back, and led first section up. Sergeant Sewell Crowell blew the wire with a Bangalore torpedo. They climbed. A Polish conscript in German uniform surrendered. Stretchick, in fluent Polish, interrogated him on the spot. By 08:30 on D-Day, men of E Company, 16th Infantry, were standing behind the German defences on the bluffs of Omaha Beach. Theirs was among the very first American breaches of Hitler's Atlantic Wall. Stretchick was decorated with the Distinguished Service Cross by Eisenhower personally on July 7, 1944. Spaulding's Distinguished Service Cross was presented less than 2 weeks later. 20 minutes after Spaulding climbed the bluff, Captain Joseph Dawson of G Company, 16th Infantry, was leading his own men up another ravine. Dawson was the son of a Baptist preacher from Texas, a former oil geologist who had traded a comfortable civilian career for an infantry commission. G Company suffered roughly 63 casualties on the beach. Dawson, disregarding orders to attack up a designated draw, found a mined ravine, crawled forward, and personally killed a German machine gun team on the bluff top with 2 perfectly thrown grenades. Most historians credit Dawson and his company with being among the first American formations to reach the top of the Omaha Bluffs intact. He was decorated with the Distinguished Service Cross by Eisenhower. He later led G Company through the bloody 39-day fight for Aachen. In 1994, President Bill Clinton invited him back to Omaha to introduce him at the 50th anniversary commemoration. 20 miles west of Spalding, on Dog White, a 29-year-old second lieutenant named Walter Taylor stepped off a landing craft that had landed B Company, 116th Infantry, in fragments. Taylor's commanding officers were dead before he learned their names. Of his initial 20 men, 4 were killed almost at once. Taylor led the survivors over the seawall, through a gap in the wire, and into Vierville-sur-Mer. He linked up with elements of G Company and other Virginia stonewallers, attacked a fortified chateau, captured German prisoners, including a Wehrmacht doctor he placed on parole to care for his own wounded, and was driven back to the chateau by 3 truckloads of German infantry, where his men held until relieved. A B Company sergeant later told the War Department's Historical Division that Taylor was an inspired leader throughout that day, that he seemed to have no fear of anything, and that no matter where he went, he was in the lead, either of the march or of the fight. "We followed him," the sergeant said, "because there was nothing else to do." Taylor was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for that day. He was wounded twice more before VE Day, at Saint-Lô and in Belgium, and lived until 2003. 4 miles west of Vierville, on a 90-degree cliff jutting into the English Channel, the 2nd Ranger Battalion, under 34-year-old Lieutenant Colonel James Earl Rudder, scaled 100-foot heights that General Omar Bradley had called the most dangerous mission of D-Day. The plan called for D, E, and F companies to land at the base of Pointe du Hoc at 0630, scale the cliffs, and destroy 6 heavy artillery pieces that could range Omaha and Utah beaches. Tides and a navigational error put them ashore 40 minutes late. Rudder's 225 men reached the cliff top to discover that the German guns had been moved. First Sergeant Leonard Lamel and Staff Sergeant Jack Kuhn followed a battle-cratered farm road inland and found 5 of the 6 guns still in their alternate position, abandoned and unguarded behind a hedgerow. Using thermite grenades, they spiked the gun mechanisms. Rudder was wounded twice but held the point through 2 German counterattacks until relief from Omaha arrived on June 8. Of the 225 Rangers who came ashore, 77 were killed, 152 wounded, and 38 missing. Rudder received the Distinguished Service Cross. The 2nd Ranger Battalion was awarded the Presidential Unit Citation. Rudder went on to become president of Texas A&M University. Inland, near a hamlet called Le Grand Chemin, south of Sainte-Marie-du-Mont, a 26-year-old paratrooper from Ephrata, Pennsylvania, named Richard Winters, had landed in scattered drops the previous night. He had lost his weapons in his leg bag and was walking through Norman fields with a borrowed rifle. His company commander had been killed with the rest of E Company headquarters in a transport aircraft crash. Winters was now, by default, acting commanding officer of Easy Company, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 101st Airborne Division. His battalion commander gave him an order so vague that it has become a textbook case of mission command. "There is fire along that hedgerow there. Take care of it." The hedgerow contained a 4-gun battery of German 105mm howitzers firing onto Causeway, 2 leading off Utah Beach, defended by an estimated company of paratroopers and supporting machine gun teams. Winters, with an initial assault element of about a dozen men collected from Easy, Dog, and Fox companies, paratroopers, who in many cases had never met before, used fire and movement, the principle of attacking objectives in sequence, and trench-clearing assault tactics that the United States Military Academy at West Point still teaches today. Reinforced as the action progressed, the small force grew to roughly 24 attackers. They knocked out all 4 guns. They killed approximately 15 Germans and captured several more. In one howitzer position, they captured a German map showing every artillery and machine gun position on the Cotentin Peninsula. The intelligence officer ran it 3 miles to the beach, where it gave the 4th Infantry Division the targets it had been groping for. A statue of Winters stands today near the assault site, dedicated to all junior United States military officers. 3 days west of D-Day, the 82nd Airborne fought the savagest small unit action of the Normandy campaign at a bridge called La Fière. The Murderet River, deliberately flooded by the Germans, made a 600-yard causeway, the only crossing west of Saint-Omer-Église for the entire 7th Corps. After 3 days of attacks and counterattacks, Brigadier General James Gavin ordered a frontal charge across the causeway on June 9 at 10:30 in the morning. The charge was assigned to the 3rd Battalion, 325th Glider Infantry Regiment, but at the last moment, when the battalion's commander, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Carroll, told Gavin he was too ill to lead the assault, Gavin relieved him on the spot and elevated the regiment's intelligence officer, Major Arthur Gardner, to take command. It nearly broke. Glidermen were cut down on the open road. Gavin watched dozens fall. He turned to a 28-year-old captain from the 507th Parachute Infantry Regiment, Robert Ray, commanding a scratch composite company built from misdropped paratroopers, and said simply, "All right, you have got to go." Ray led roughly 90 men across the causeway in 2 columns at a run, shouting at glidermen to follow. Many did. The combined push reached the far village of Coquigny and broke German resistance. The 82nd lost more than 500 casualties on La Fière Causeway. Today, the Iron Mike statue stands above it. 2 days later, on June 11, Lieutenant Colonel Robert Cole, 29 years old, West Point class of 1939, son of an army doctor, commanded 3rd Battalion of the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment. His 265 men, advancing down 4 causewayed bridges over the Douve River outside the town of Carentan, were pinned in the open by entrenched paratroopers of the German 6th Parachute Regiment. After more than an hour of withering fire, with no air support coming and casualties mounting, Cole made a decision that has no real parallel in modern American war: fix bayonets. He blew his whistle, fired a smoke screen, drew his sidearm, and led the survivors in a charge across open fields. Roughly half his men followed him in the first surge. The rest joined as the German line broke. The charge, known to the 101st simply as Cole's charge, cost 130 of the 265 men of his battalion dead or wounded, but cracked the German defense. Cole was recommended for the Medal of Honor. He never lived to receive it. On September 18, 1944, while directing close air support during Operation Market Garden near the village of Best in the Netherlands, he raised his head from cover to spot an aircraft and was killed instantly by a German sniper firing from a farmhouse roughly 300 yards away. The Medal of Honor was awarded 2 weeks after his death. His mother accepted it on the parade ground at Fort Sam Houston, where Cole had played as a child. He is buried at the Netherlands American Cemetery in the village of Margreton. While the European theatre was producing these names, the Pacific had been teaching the same lessons earlier and harder. On Guadalcanal, in September 1942, Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson, known to his Marines as Red Mike, commanded the 1st Marine Raider Battalion. He had earned a Navy Cross years earlier in Nicaragua and a 2nd Navy Cross at Tulagi just weeks before. Combined with the 1st Parachute Battalion, his force totaled about 840 Marines. On the night of September 12, on a low spine of coral south of Henderson Field, Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi attacked with roughly 3,000 Japanese infantrymen. Edson, anticipating the assault despite his division commander's belief that an attack would come from the coast, had positioned his men along the ridge. The attack was beaten back over 2 nights of point-blank fighting. Edson exposed himself to enemy fire as he encouraged and directed his Marines. Marine casualties were heavy. Japanese losses were estimated between 700 and 1,200 dead. Edson was awarded the Medal of Honor. In the official Marine narrative, what the men called Edson's Ridge is the night Henderson Field was saved. With it, possibly, was saved the entire Pacific timeline. 6 weeks later, Lieutenant Colonel Louis Puller, known to history as Chesty, commanded 1st Battalion, 7th Marines. With about 700 men, alongside the 3rd Battalion, 164th Infantry, the 1st Army unit to fight on Guadalcanal, Puller held a 2,500-yard sector against 2 regiments of the Japanese Sendai Division on the night of October 24 to 25, 1942. The fighting lasted into the small hours. Bayonets, machine guns firing through their water jackets, Sergeant John Basilone running ammunition through the dark. By dawn, the Marines had suffered roughly 70 casualties. They counted more than 1,400 Japanese dead in front of the wire. Basilone was decorated with the Medal of Honor. Puller earned the third of his 5 Navy Crosses. Tarawa is the war's most painfully literal example of a plan dying on the reef. The 2nd Marine Division's assault on Betio Island on November 20, 1943, was the first time United States forces ever attacked a Japanese garrison, defending a fortified beach. The operations officer who designed the plan, Colonel David Shoup, had been promoted to colonel and given command of the assault regiment only 11 days before the operation, after his predecessor was deemed medically unfit. The plan depended on landing craft floating across the fringing reef at high tide. By chance, that day fell on a rare neap tide, one of only 2 such phenomena that entire year. No standard landing craft ever crossed the reef in the first 30 hours of the assault. The first 3 waves of amphibious tractors got men ashore. Subsequent waves of Higgins boats grounded on the reef, and Marines waded 600 yards into machine gun fire. Within hours, 1 in 3 was a casualty. Shoup himself, ashore in mid-morning, lost his amphibious tractor to a shell, took shrapnel in the leg, and stood waist-deep in the water directing landings. By 4 in the afternoon on D+1, after he had personally rallied stragglers, ordered the 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 2nd Marines to advance across the airfield, and called in destroyer fire at point-blank range, he sent the message that became Marine Corps legend: casualties many, percentage dead not known, combat efficiency, we are winning. He was awarded the Medal of Honor. Tarawa is also the story of 1st Lieutenant Alexander Bonnyman, Jr., 33 years old, executive officer of the 2nd Battalion Shore Party, 8th Marines. He was the Knoxville-raised son of a coal magnate who, by 1941, was running his own copper mine in New Mexico. He enlisted as a private in the Marines in July 1942, earned a battlefield commission on Guadalcanal, and was, technically, a logistics officer. On D+2, a huge concrete bomb-proof shelter on Betio held roughly 150 Japanese troops and dominated the central beachhead. Bonnyman, who was supposed to be running supplies, organized a 21-man assault team. He walked them up the seaward slope of the bunker with flamethrowers and demolitions. Marine combat cameras were rolling, capturing footage that would become part of the documentary With the Marines at Tarawa, the first film of a Medal of Honor action ever recorded. Bonnyman placed charges. He stood at the bunker's lip, firing a carbine. He was killed at the top, but the bunker fell. The Medal of Honor was presented to his 12-year-old daughter Frances by the Secretary of the Navy in 1947. His remains, lost in the chaos of the cemetery on Betio, were finally recovered in 2015 and returned to Knoxville. 8 of the original 21 Marines on Bonnyman's assault were killed. By February 1945, the Pacific War had crossed the threshold of the Japanese home islands. On the volcanic island of Iwo Jima, E Company, 2nd Battalion, 28th Marines, 5th Marine Division, landed on the southern beaches at approximately 9:55 in the morning of February 19, under Captain Dave Severance, a parachutist officer raised in Greeley, Colorado. Easy Company landed unopposed for about 20 minutes. Then Japanese guns opened. Over the next 4 days, fighting through volcanic ash that swallowed boots and sucked momentum out of attacks, Severance's company moved across the southern neck of the island. On February 23, ordered by his battalion commander to send 1 platoon up Mount Suribachi, Severance gave the job to 3rd Platoon under his executive officer, 1st Lieutenant Harold Schreier. With 12 weapons platoon Marines attached, the battalion commander handed Schreier a flag and told him, "If you get to the top, put it up." The first flag went up around 10:30 in the morning. A second, larger flag went up a few hours later, the one in the famous photograph. Of the 310 Marines and corpsmen who served with E Company on Iwo Jima, only 50 walked off the island when the battle ended, an 84% casualty rate. Severance was the only Easy Company officer to walk off intact. He died in 2021 at 102 years old. 8 months earlier, an American second lieutenant in a Norman field had improvised an attack with strangers. 8 months later, in a snowy forest in Belgium, a 20-year-old Army lieutenant from St. Louis, Missouri, would do something even harder. The Hürtgen Forest had taught its hard lessons by then. The 28th Infantry Division's catastrophic battle for the village of Schmidt, fought from November 2 through November 8, was a junior leaders' war, fought essentially by squads. The army committed at least 9 divisions to the Hurtgen between September 1944 and February 1945, and sustained around 24,000 battle casualties in the first 3 months. On broken terrain with shattered communications, sergeants and lieutenants were often the only commanders who mattered. Then came December 16, 1944, the Battle of the Bulge. 18 American soldiers and 4 forward observers stood in a pine tree line above a Belgian hamlet of 23 houses called Lanzerath. They were the intelligence and reconnaissance platoon of the 394th Infantry Regiment, 99th Infantry Division, a unit not trained for direct combat, under 20-year-old First Lieutenant Lyle Bouck, Jr. of St. Louis, Missouri. Bouck would turn 21 at midnight that very night in a German cellar after his platoon was overrun. His 4 artillery observers came from a battery of the 371st Field Artillery Battalion under First Lieutenant Warren Springer. At 5:30 in the morning, the entire German 6th Panzer Army opened fire across the Loschim Gap. The supporting tank destroyer section from the 14th Cavalry Group withdrew without telling Bouck. His phone line to regiment was cut. His radio was jammed. His order from his major was simple: hold at all costs. In front of him by mid-morning was the 1st Battalion of the 9th Parachute Regiment, 3rd Parachute Division, roughly 500 men. Behind those men, on the road north into Lanzerath, was Joachim Paper's 1st Schutzstaffel Panzer Regiment, the spearhead of the entire northern thrust, scheduled to be at the town of Stavelot that night. Bouck waited. He held his fire as long as he could. When the German paratroopers finally moved into the open meadow below his position, he gave the signal to open fire. Across the next 20 hours, the platoon and the 4 forward observers repulsed 3 frontal assaults across that meadow. A heavy machine gun overheated and seized. One private had his face nearly destroyed by a rifle round. Riflemen moved between foxholes, hauling ammunition by hand. The platoon ultimately killed or wounded 92 Germans by United States count, surrendering only after dark when wounded, surrounded, and out of ammunition. The historical consequence was decisive. Paper's spearhead was held east of Lanzerath for nearly 18 hours behind schedule. The official army history of the Ardennes treats this as the single most important delay on the northern shoulder of the entire German offensive. Paper himself, when his subordinate told him an entire American regiment was blocking the road, exploded in disbelief, until German searchers cleared the woods that night and found that the regiment was actually a single understrength platoon. The platoon was overrun and captured intact. They were prisoners for 5 months. After the war, the action was nearly forgotten. A columnist named Jack Anderson wrote about it in 1977. The United States Army formally re-recognized the platoon in October 1981. Every man on that ridge was eventually decorated. The platoon received the Presidential Unit Citation, 4 Distinguished Service Crosses, 5 Silver Stars, and 9 Bronze Stars with V device. It remains the most decorated American platoon for a single action of the entire Second World War. A few miles north, the green 99th Infantry Division, the so-called Battle Babies, was being rolled back through what the locals called the twin villages of Krinkelt and Rocherath. The veteran 2nd Infantry Division was thrown sideways into the gap. On the road south, on December 17, Major General Walter Robertson personally split his lead battalion, the 1st Battalion, 9th Infantry, under Lieutenant Colonel William McKinley, the great-nephew of the United States President of the same name, and ordered McKinley to a crossroads called Lousdale, east of Rocherath. There, McKinley's battalion fought one of the most lopsided defensive actions of the war, a single battalion blocking elements of the 12th Schutzstaffel Panzer Division. Companies fought house to house with anti-tank teams using sticky bombs. A communications lieutenant named Jesse Morrow grabbed a bazooka flung from a jeep and knocked out a German tank, described in some sources as a Tiger at close range, an action that won him the Distinguished Service Cross. The villages traded hands building by building. By December 19, the 2nd Infantry Division held the western edge. By the 20th, the survivors withdrew to a feature called Elsenborn Ridge, and the entire northern German offensive was effectively pinned. 20 miles south, at the Belgian crossroads town of St. Vith, Brigadier General Bruce Clark, newly arrived as commander of Combat Command B of the 7th Armoured Division, refused to be drawn into a fortress-style perimeter defense. Instead, he fought a 6-day mobile delay against elements of General Hasso von Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army. The German timetable required St. Vith on December 17. Clark kept it until December 21 and held the surrounding terrain until December 23. After the war, Manteufel told Clark that the brilliant, outstanding delaying action around St. Vith had been decisive, that the lost week had ruined the entire timing of the offensive. In Bastogne, the popular memory belongs to the 101st Airborne and Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe's famous one-word reply of nuts to a German surrender demand. But the first combat unit to arrive in that town was Combat Command B of the 10th Armoured Division under Colonel William Roberts on the evening of December 18. Roberts split his combat command on the spot into 3 teams to plug the Eastern Road network. Team Cherry under Lieutenant Colonel Henry Cherry, Team O'Hara under Lieutenant Colonel James O'Hara, and Team Desabry under 26-year-old Major William Desabry. Each team was a battalion task force facing a panzer division. At the village of Neuville on December 19, Desabry, with about 400 men, 15 Sherman tanks, and 4 tank destroyers, fought the 2nd Panzer Division to a halt for 2 days before withdrawing. Reinforced midday by the 1st Battalion of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment under Lieutenant Colonel James Leprade, who was killed in action that day. Team Desabry destroyed an estimated 30 German tanks at Neuville. Combat Command B took roughly 500 casualties at Bastogne. Like the 101st Airborne, it received the Presidential Unit Citation. McAuliffe later said publicly that, in his opinion, the Combat Command was never properly credited with its important role in the Bastogne battle. After Patton's celebrated 90-degree turn from the Saar, the relief column to Bastogne was led by the 4th Armoured Division. By the afternoon of December 26, the spearhead, the 37th Tank Battalion under Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, was down to 20 Sherman tanks. A few miles short of Bastogne, near the village of Cloquimont, Abrams and his infantry counterpart watched supply aircraft drop containers into Bastogne and made the spontaneous decision to drive straight up the secondary road through a village called Assenois without further plan. At the head of the column, in a heavily armoured Sherman tank named Cobra King, sat First Lieutenant Charles Boggis. His crew were Corporal Milton Dickerman as gunner, Private James Murphy as loader, Private Hubert Smith as driver, and Private Harold Hafner as assistant driver and bow gunner. At about 4:20 in the afternoon they jumped off. American artillery, 2,340 rounds in all, pre-saturated Assenois. Boggis drove through the village at top speed, past blockhouses on the wooded ridge beyond, destroyed a German pillbox on the way, and at 4:50 in the afternoon on December 26, rolled up to a line of foxholes at the edge of Bastogne. He shouted, "Come on out, this is the 4th Armoured." A lieutenant named Dwayne Webster of the 326th Engineer Battalion of the 101st Airborne Division stepped out, walked over, and reached up his hand. "I am Lieutenant Webster of the 326th Engineers," he said. "Glad to see you." Boggis was the first American to enter Bastogne from outside since December 19. Cobra King itself, after a weather-erased chalk legend reading "First in Bastogne," was lost to history for decades. A young sergeant first suspected the tank's identity at a base in Vilseck, Germany in 2004, and an army chaplain pursued the research until the army officially confirmed the tank's identity in 2008. It was shipped to the United States the following summer. It is on display today at the National Museum of the United States Army at Fort Belvoir, Virginia. A month after Bastogne, in eastern France, 2 final cases closed the loop on what American small unit leadership looked like by the last winter of the war. Second Lieutenant Audie Murphy, 19 years old, 5 feet 5 inches tall, an orphan from Hunt County, Texas, who had lied about his age to enlist, commanded Company B, 1st Battalion, 15th Infantry Regiment, 3rd Infantry Division. By January 26, 1945, he was already a veteran of Sicily, Salerno, Anzio, and the breakout to the Vosges. He had earned the Distinguished Service Cross, 2 Silver Stars, and 2 Bronze Stars. In the Colmar pocket near the village of Holtzwihr, Murphy's reduced company, about 19 men still capable of combat, was attacked by 6 German tanks and waves of infantry. Murphy ordered his men to withdraw to a tree line. He stayed forward at his command post telephone, calling artillery onto his own coordinates. An American tank destroyer beside him took a direct hit and burned. Its crew bailed out into the woods. Murphy, exposed on the burning tank destroyer's deck and in immediate danger of riding it skyward when the fuel cooked off, climbed up, manned its heavy machine gun, and held off the German infantry alone for over an hour while continuing to direct artillery by field telephone. His Medal of Honor citation records that he was wounded in the leg, that his directing of artillery fire wiped out many of the enemy, that he killed or wounded approximately 50 German soldiers, and that he refused medical aid until he had organized his company's counterattack. After the war, Murphy received every United States Valor decoration available to a soldier of his rank and starred in the film adaptation of his own memoir, To Hell and Back, and in many other features. He died in a plane crash in 1971 and is buried at Arlington National Cemetery, where his grave remains the second most visited. When asked after the war why he had climbed onto the burning tank destroyer, Murphy answered simply that they had killed his friends. A year before Holtzwihr, 50 miles south of Rome, on January 28, 1944, technician 5th grade Eric Gunnar Gibson, a Swedish-born company cook of the 3rd Infantry Division, who had personally bargained with his officers to be allowed forward, led a squad of green replacements through their first action down a drainage ditch. He placed himself 50 yards ahead of his squad, charged a German machine pistol position alone, killed the gunner at point-blank range, was knocked flat by an artillery near-miss, charged a second position, 75 yards distant under crossing machine gun fire, killed one and captured another, then crawled 125 yards under artillery and 2 machine guns to assault a heavy machine gun emplacement with grenades and a submachine gun. He killed 2 more and took a 3rd prisoner. Going forward alone to reconnoiter around a bend, he was killed firing at a German outpost. In a single morning, a Swedish-American company cook destroyed 4 enemy positions, killed 5, captured 3, secured his unit's flank, and saved the lives of soldiers he had met that morning. The Medal of Honor was presented to his parents at Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, on September 15, 1944. The Quartermaster Hall of Fame inducted him in 1999. A United States Army container ship still bears his name today. If the German Army had a name for what these men did, and the United States Army of 1944 did not, the question is why the American version so often outperformed on the day. 2 reasons emerge from the records. The first is selection. Officer candidate schools were producing tens of thousands of commissioned junior officers per year at peak production. They were not trained for 10 years in a closed military caste system. They were trained for 90 days and shoved into the gap. The result was that the American officer corps that hit Omaha and Tarawa was full of men whose civilian habits had been entrepreneurial, scrappy, problem-solving habits. They had run gas stations. They had sold insurance. They had played college football. They knew how to look at a broken situation and improvise their way out of it, because that is what civilian American life had taught them since boyhood. The second reason is doctrine. The Infantry and Battle Manual of 1934 taught its readers, through case study after case study, that small groups of resolute men decided engagements. By 1942, Field Manual 100-5, titled simply Operations, explicitly endorsed lower-level initiative. American doctrine on paper looked top-down. American doctrine in the Field Handbook was bottom-up. The officers who had absorbed infantry in battle in the 1930s, men like Cotter, Edson, Puller, Rudder, were in command of regiments and brigades by 1944, and they wanted lieutenants who would move. The historical record contains a famous claim that needs honest treatment. An Army historian named S.L.A. Marshall published a book in 1947 called Men Against Fire, in which he argued that only 15 to 25% of American infantrymen ever fired their weapons in combat. Modern scholarship, particularly Roger Spiller's 1988 essay in the Royal United Services Institute Journal, has demonstrated that Marshall's specific statistics appear to have been guessed or fabricated. The honest claim is therefore narrower. The men named in this story were a few. The records show what they did. Marshall is not necessary to the argument. The men of this story are commemorated today in unusually concrete ways. A path still climbs from the eastern end of Easy Red, beneath the Normandy American Cemetery at Colleville-sur-Mer. Retracing the route, Spaulding and Stretchick took up the bluff. The Pointe du Hoc Ranger Monument, dedicated to Rudder's men, was transferred to American Battle Monuments Commission care in 1979 and stands today on the cliff edge they climbed. The Richard Winters Leadership Monument outside Sainte-Marie-du-Mont was dedicated on June 6, 2012, inscribed simply, to all junior United States military officers. The Iron Mike statue stands above the Lafayette Causeway. A monument was unveiled on the Lanzerath Ridge in May 2005. Murphy's grave at Arlington remains the second most visited. Gibson's name still travels the Pacific on the deck of an Army container ship. Bonnyman, recovered from a forgotten cemetery on a coral atoll 72 years after he was killed, rests today in Knoxville, Tennessee. 80 years later, the institutional army has finally found a name for what these men did. It calls it Mission Command, and it is taught in every staff, college, and embedded in modern army doctrine. The doctrine catalogues their lesson in clean prose. Subordinates execute the higher commander's intent within their own initiative. But the men in this story did not have a doctrine. They had a problem. The boats were in the wrong place. The captain was dead. The radio was wet. The wire was uncut. The bunker held 150 Japanese troops. The howitzers were ranging the beach. The Panzer Division was coming up the road. The plan was useless. And somewhere on the other side of the field, the war was waiting to be won by whoever decided what to do next. In the records of this war, that someone was very often a lieutenant or a sergeant. That is the lesson of these stories. Not heroism exactly. Not even courage, in any easy sense. Something quieter and harder to name. The willingness to act, when there is no good script to follow, because the alternative is to watch your friends die. In every army of every war, plans break. Generals know this. Sergeants know this. The men in this story knew it before they ever set foot on a transport. What set them apart was a habit of mind. A willingness to be the person who decided, in the next 30 seconds, what would happen next, when no one else was going to. They did not all survive it. Cole was shot in the head in a Dutch field 3 months after his bayonet charge. Bonnyman died at the top of the bunker on Betio. Laprade was killed at Norville. Edson and Stretchick both lived through the war and carried it with them until it took them, years later, in ways the medical language of their time could not yet name. The cost of being the man who decides first is not a footnote, it is the central fact. But the cost is also the meaning. When American history asks itself why the Second World War turned out the way it did, the answer is not only industrial production, or naval mass, or strategic bombing. The answer, on the day, was a sergeant who could read the ground better than the planners, a captain who threw 2 grenades over a bluff, a lieutenant who fixed bayonets, a cook who insisted on a rifle, a platoon leader who held his fire until the right moment, a tank commander who drove through Assiniboia at top speed, a 19-year-old Texan on a burning tank destroyer. These men kept the attacks moving when there was no one else left to move them. They did not wait for new orders. They did not wait for the situation to become clear. They did not wait for someone braver, or older, or more certain to arrive. They went forward with whoever was left, into whatever was waiting, because going forward was the only thing left to do. And in doing so, they decided the outcome of a war that the careful plans, the senior generals, and the printed orders could not, by themselves, have won. That is the legacy of the American junior leader in the Second World War. Not a doctrine, not a slogan, a habit of decision, a refusal to wait. A small, determined act, repeated by enough men, in enough places, on enough days, until a continent was free. They decided. And the war was won by men deciding.